Okay, let's do it. It's been a couple of months since I introduced the subject of this series of videos, which is the book that I wrote a year or so ago. The first video was really only dealing with my approach and didn't go too much into the material, and I said I would do more videos going into the actual text, and I'm going to do something a little bit disjointed and go straight to the end of the book first. And the reason for that is because I'm a little bit excited to talk about the later chapter in the book. In fact, the last essay, which makes up the main sort of what you could call sensible or like rational part of the book. The essay called Sensibilitate Genii Locorum. And I wanted to just go on to that one first because I was keen to talk about that subject, really. The subject being animism. Animism is a subject which is studied in sociology, but which really deals with a fundamental human experience, in my opinion. Maybe not for everyone, though it's always available to everyone, because it basically just means viewing the world as ensouled. This kind of philosophy is a bit more popular nowadays. I know that Gordon White from Rune Soup has published a book which is relatively popular discussing animism. I haven't actually read it, so I don't know what he says about it, though it's just interesting because it's a novel topic, really. It's a novel topic within the world of Western esoteric books anyway, because though there's some animist leanings all the way through the esoteric sort of tradition, to come out and blatantly deal with animism as a philosophy is a very new thing. It's usually thought of as something existing outside the West. Something that is mostly, I think, mostly associated with indigenous Amazonian cultures, really. I'm not a sociologist, to be fair, so maybe just what it looks like from the outside. This is how it looks from the outside, but from the outside it looks like the word animism is mostly associated with the study of Amazonian cultures, and a little bit in Caribbean cultures, the cultures in what we call Australasia, and a little bit the shamanic cultures of the steppe. However, we have a kind of similar philosophy which is exclusively Western, called panpsychism. And panpsychism is much the same, really, in terms of its, in the loosest sense, a philosophy of everything having a mind, or everything having a soul, or the mind being a fundamental component of the world, so that rather than they be emergent, minds being an emergent phenomena, meaning that they suddenly kind of appear as a symptom of a brain, and consciousness is a symptom of a brain. Panpsychists would say that consciousness is a symptom of matter, actually, and that ego consciousness and human consciousness is a human experience because of our brains kind of accumulating all that consciousness into a kind of organic machine, etc. But that really, it's everywhere, in just different states. And to be honest, though it doesn't speculate too much on what that would look like, it's really getting at the same thing as animism. The animism, because it's just unfair really to use that word, but what we call animism would just be more of a study into how panpsychism looks to people who have always taken that for granted, that other things than humans are conscious. And in this essay, I used panpsychism, or animism really, I use the word animism a lot, to frame some of my own experiences. Some specific experiences concerning dreams, and some meditation that I was doing, trying to engage the world as though you can take it for granted that things have a soul. Another thing worth mentioning is that alchemy, really, certain readings of alchemy, especially a kind of Jungian reading of alchemy, Silbera's reading of alchemy, Paracelsus's writings, the more mystical alchemists, although they don't say it, it's kind of implicit in what they do say, that alchemy is really leaning into that type of idea that things are ensouled, things are persons. It's something that obviously is an argued about topic, that maybe alchemy is only material, maybe it's not, but certain readings of it always have been that it's mystical, and if it is mystical, it has to be in a certain measure animist. The way in which alchemists went about their work implies that there's a certain amount of agency in things, and that the alchemist is a kind of tutor to material, helping it go in the direction that it wants to through mystical approaches. And I believe that alchemy really falls quite neatly into a panpsychist worldview. And it's not unreasonable for Westerners to adopt a panpsychist approach, because science and kind of rational thought even is not completely against the idea. I mean, the brain, the idea that the brain is the center of all consciousness, is not easily proved, and I don't believe you have to be a kind of culturally appropriating people outside the West necessarily to go there, and that looking at those people is really looking up to them with respect, and as maybe kind of people with more experience or more knowledge in that way of seeing things. So I felt within my rights to write about it, really. I don't think it's completely out of the question, even if you were a kind of scientific devotee, to posit that idea. And if you posit that idea, why not run with it? Another interesting thing which has happened since I wrote the book, and which has been quite pleasing to me, is a lady called Diana Taylor has written a film, and possibly a book, I'm not sure, but it's called Zena, Spirit of Place. if you read the essay, you'll see that part of my argument for animism was this idea of place. I even used the term place quite a bit. And just in a way, I was arguing that places potentially could have these kind of personalities and actually be a person, maybe even kind of metaphysically, that they are a thing, an entity that you can engage with. And Diana Taylor's used the same kind of terminology in the title of her film. Not only that, Zena is a village not far from where I grew up. And it doesn't surprise me to a certain extent. That place is very evocative. It does feel like it has a soul or a soulfulness, and her film specifically is talking about people who are drawn there for that reason. It's something that's quite common, and it's pleasing to me because I never approached these ideas as an academic. I've only sort of started to take academia seriously because it was giving language and ideas and kind of educated discussion to an experience that I was having in that place, unrelated to books that I've been reading and things like that. It's quite an isolated place. It's very rural. It's got a pagan history. There's no cities or anything like that. I didn't grow up with your kind of concrete jungle. I grew up with the sea, with sailing, with surfing. I played in the woods. I walked long distances. I spent nights alone as a kid and things like that out in nature. And there was a kind of abundance of like mystical feeling, I would call it now. There was an abundance of sort of certain type of experiences, kind of quite heightened experiences, and very connected to nature. I can only speak for myself, but I felt them to be quite mystical. And to have not only academics telling us of people in faraway places, that there are whole traditions of socially acceptable worldviews which would kind of make those types of experiences seem quite normal, but also to have other artists in the UK and things like that, and with Gordon in Australia, to have those people talking in this way and giving credibility and like a shared experience around this type of thing, it made me feel a lot more comfortable with something which as well I regarded as quite important. It seemed like quite a big part of my life, really, quite a big part of the experiences that I had growing up, which created who I was. These aren't idiots, and these aren't kind of extreme people with totally unacceptable views. They're quite smart, well-read people, and they're giving legitimacy to something which I didn't have language for, or ideas for, or precedent for. And so I'm quite grateful for that. I'm quite grateful. Another thing worth mentioning as well is that this is a kind of etymological sort of nuance to do with this whole body of ideas, this whole sort of school of thinking, is that both of these words, the one animism, which is more kind of a sociological term, and panpsychism, which is more of a sort of Western philosophical term, they both use words meaning soul. So psyche is the Greek word for soul, and anima is the Latin word for soul, or animus. And so that, I think that maybe corrupts the ideas a little bit. It makes them sound, dare I say it, a little bit Christian, though I don't think they are supposed to be. But saying soul for a lot of people is quite difficult. You can't really define it. What does soul mean? Soul's really only understood in terms of this Christian metaphysics of going to somewhere after you die and things like that. And so you really have to be careful, and you really have to do your due diligence, both reading these works and talking about experiences using those words, because it's just, to me, something so like natural and fundamental to life for a lot of people, and it doesn't necessarily have doctrine and borders where certain things are ensouled to certain people within certain sort of schools of thought or cultures or religions, and not to others. Really, it just means that the world is a living thing, this anima mundi, that the world maybe is an organism, and that shouldn't belong to anyone or any tradition. It's available to everyone to just feel like their environment has agency and has soul, or whatever you want to call it. And this is where I feel like the explaining needs to be done, because we can get sort of dragged downstream or upstream into sort of territory that I don't really like to go to. For me, just as a person, with no prejudices at all, I just, for a certain amount of time especially, and even still today, don't like to limit myself to the idea that it's only us. Simple as that. It's not just us here. And a guy I follow on Instagram, Potions, Powders and Sundries, the Special Man, I think he goes as. He's been talking a fair bit about humanism as this idea that the world is here for us, the world is here for humans. And I'm not hugely well read on humanism, but it sounds like that's what he's getting at himself. We're not the only ones here. We've been thinking that we are for a long time. And it might not just be a heuristic, or it might not just be a marketing ploy. It might be an actual provable fact one day. And if not a provable fact, just a fact. It might just be the case that we are only a certain type of very isolated creature or consciousness, just oblivious to all the other people. And people's a funny word because it's got connotations of human being, but other lives, like these plants are living, but why are they not treated as individuals, or why is their life different? Maybe it's not, and maybe it's philosophies of humanism which has kind of confused us on that topic. So yeah, shout out to those guys and everyone else who's interested, really. So the specifics then of this chapter. So I go, it's a funny one actually. It's partly narrative and partly pseudo-academia. The first couple of sub-chapters I'm trying to set up to someone who might not be convinced. I'm trying to set up an argument which makes panpsychism or animism sound plausible. And I try doing that by arguing for places as being persons. It may be a bit convoluted, my argument, but it does kind of make sense to me. I think that as a surfer, when I was younger, I saw a lot of people have a real knack for reading quite strange environments. And I don't think it's metaphorical in the sense that they maybe had a relationship to those places or were able to engage in relationship with those places. Obviously, you could just say, oh, they understand that place like an old lover or like an old friend. And that would be a metaphorical way of framing those people's kind of affinity. But I don't think it necessarily is like that. What would be the metaphorized alternative? What would be the actual fact in that situation? Would it be just an uncanny ability to surf in those people, or an uncanny ability to survive in the wild for those people? And why is that ability different to the ability to get on with another human being? I don't think that they are different necessarily. They might be exactly the same. People maybe get on with each other because they treat each other with objective knowledge about them, but that's no different to the objective knowledge that they treat a place with. But people aren't objects. They're subjects. They have subjectivity. And just because the law only frames humans as being subjects, it doesn't mean that they are subjects exclusively. So, getting a bit lost in objective, subjective dichotomy, and it might be confusing, but just the sheer fact that you can have a relationship with a person, and when you do something, they do something back, and you anticipate that action-reaction and get along. It's exactly the same in the sea, or on a mountain, or in a city. And it's not an unreasonable question, but it's quite an obscure question to ask, is that because those places have a person? They're a person. They have a personality. They respond. They have their own desire and identity and idiosyncrasies. You know, it's really about how do you define a person, and if you have a term person, why is it limited to human beings? You know, you might say, well, it's because they can speak or they can think, but you can't prove that they can think. You can only prove it through their speech. You can see where I'm going. We've got chatbots, we've got mute people who can't speak, we've got all these things which make that a really hard and convoluted argument. And someone may want to go with that, may want to kind of take that argument and try and find an end to it through a kind of dialectic approach, but I just skip that dialectic approach myself and just act as if it were already proven. Some of the best adventures start by acting first and thinking later. But I still tried to go on a bit of an academic kind of search for the truth, I guess, for a couple of chapters. So I talked a little bit about, cultivating your relationship with the place. And then I talked a little bit about semiotic rewilding. Now that comes from reading that I did, the sociological reading that I did. Jeremy Narby and Eduardo Cohn, specifically. These guys made me think a bit about, where do symbols come from? Are they organic? If they're organic, are they only in humans? Maybe there's symbols not only in the brains of humans, but in the kind of body of fauna, or anything, and we're just the only ones who decide to represent them with signs on pictures and things like that. But really, that original symbol that occurs in the mind might be occurring in these plants, and maybe that's what creates their geometry and how they know to turn towards the sun and things like that. And I believe that there's a kind of artificial semiotics in these things, like, marketing devices like the Nike tick and things like that. They become our kind of favourite semiotic devices, but that we have ones that occur to us organically as well. And Jeremy Narby and Eduardo Cohn have written good books discussing that at length. That sub-chapter leads on to one on temperance. Now that was a bit of a tangent, really. It was a tangent away from animism, so maybe I'll leave that for a second. But where I was going with the temperance bit was just to say that instead of going crazy at the idea of all things having a personality, take a step back and try to see how you can include it in a day-to-day life. And I come up with this term subtle mysticism as a way of doing that. A way of experiencing these kind of mystical experiences, like I said, when I had a lot, and a feeling that I had a lot when I was younger, without it negatively or destructively influencing you. And I then make the case that that's really what Druidry is about and has been about. And in that way, Druidry wasn't a complete social construct. There's a part of us which is inclined to be druidic in terms of, nature-loving, knowledge-loving, learned men. That's my idea of a druid. Learned men specifically with regards to the land and natural magic-y type stuff. Obviously, it's pretty well known that they were the upper crust in the UK before the Romans arrived. And that just goes to show that you really don't have to, go down a sort of mystical rabbit hole that leads to madness just because you revere this kind of natural magic. There's a place for an animism and a place for a nature worship amongst the upper crust. And the reason that I needed to say that was because I go on to talk about my own experiences in a way which maybe sound a little bit too fruity for some people, and I just wanted to not sound quite so worrying. So my own experiences really are what this chapter was leading up to. And in order to really do justice to it, you might have to read them. But really what those experiences were a long series of quite intense dreams. I know there's books about sort of astral planing and lucid dreaming and things like that, and you could have written quite a lot justifying where I was coming from, and I didn't feel the need to, because I was aiming the book at people who have already gone there to a certain extent. So I just delivered my experiences without kind of couching them fully in the fact that there are empirical approaches to dreams and drawing, automatic writing and things which can be quite powerful. I assumed everyone who'd be reading that much into the book was pretty cool with that stuff. But if you hadn't, it's worth saying now then that I was quite deliberately doing these things. They were self-taught to a certain extent, outside of reading books and things. I'm not a member of like any group or anything. I just read a lot of psychology, a lot of Buddhism, a little bit of sociology about the Amazon and things like that, and I just went with the flow. I went with, when I had these dreams, I stayed interested in them, and I also, because of my interest in panpsychism, was spending a lot of time considering panpsychism while I was out on walks and in nature, and just feeling quite weird and mystical in general, with new language and new confidence in it not being madness, and it led to a bit of a peak experience, really. A lot of synchronicities happened, a lot of personal revelations, a lot of like self-knowledge, and a lot of changing attitudes and things started coming to me, and I framed them. That's the important point, really, is I found a way of framing them with these philosophies. I guess ultimate reality doesn't need a frame, but it also doesn't need a book. And because I was writing a book, I had to kind of go somewhere. I found it hard. I'm maybe not a good enough writer, but I would have found it near impossible to write it without having some sort of external frame of reference. And the frame of reference that I went with was animist and panpsychist, and also polytheist, because if they seemed quite similar to me, really. It's non-dualism, maybe, to do that, to say that if there's spirits, or if there's places that are people, or if plants think and animals think, I believe that probably means that gods are able to exchange with the world that we live in, and that would be called non-dualism. And anyway, this peak experience culminated in this dream figure, this beautiful woman. She kept coming to me multiple times, and I interpreted it in a kind of symbolic sense sometimes, and at other times I felt like the need to see her as a real person, or a representation of something that was a person, that it wasn't really a human form, or it wasn't really a spirit in the same way that you could call like the human experience spirited and things like that. I never really drew exact boundaries around what it was, but whatever it was appeared multiple times and in the same way and with these very intense moods. And that all led up to stumbling across like Glastonbury, like goddess temple, and the fact that they painted a woman that looked exactly like this woman that was coming to me in dreams, as their sort of icon. She's the icon, and she's called the goddess of Avalon, which in a way to me started sounding like, well, they're associating her with this place. And I've been thinking about maybe plants have consciousness, and then in a kind of fractal sense a place has a consciousness. And you know, I don't think about it all the time anymore, but at the time it seemed really, really synchronistic. It seemed like I personally had interacted with the same thing that a load of people completely separate to me had made a sort of like cult or whatever you could call it around. It's not cult in the negative sense, but you know, a spiritual group. And I've never met any of them to chat to them to find out if that's where it comes from or what. I don't know. It's just very strange. It just seems very strange that they say, yeah, the goddess, which inhabits Avalon, which is not far from where I live, and so, you know, potentially it could be a little bit outside in the area and across the whole of Somerset, say. If she's associated with that place, maybe she visited me, you know, I don't know. Or maybe she didn't visit me, but maybe that place was represented by exactly the same figure in a way which is like empirical proof for it's not all subjective, it's not all personal imagination, we're not all solipsistically just creating our own symbols and signs and stories and things like that. Maybe there's an external world of symbols. Maybe there is a semiotics of the wilderness which is separate to us. It's not subjective, it actually is. It's a real thing. It really, really smelled of that to me, and that's what I based the chapter on. It all led up to there. And it's all on the back burner now. Once I wrote it, that was it, over and done with. There's no real way of like going any more into it than that. I could join the group and go real hard on like, you know, trying to dig deeper and things like that, but it's not really my style. I've got other things that interest me. I've got a little bit of a phobia of like getting involved in things in groups as well. So I didn't go any deeper, but it's a big what if. It was a great what if as well, and it was a great philosophical what if. It really opened my mind, and it opened my mind in a way which led me to state some sort of hypotheses. And I'll read them. Why not? These were my hypotheses that I sort of formally wrote. So number one was, places may either be inhabited by conscious agents or represented by a recognizable personage whose material existence defies the normal definition and with whom communication is possible. Number two, in their visual, aesthetic and sensible presentation, places have a character. The character acts as a signifier, unique yet sufficiently defined as to evoke innate but latent images, archetypes, or psychological processes. The mechanism by which this occurs is analogous to the way myth or fable consistently evoke the same ethical and moral conclusions in a variety of individuals from different eras or cultures. Number three, one may presuppose that the family of spiritual ideas containing an anima mundi, of nature and the world being a feminine principle or belonging to a feminine goddess, are evidence for a theological tradition based on ideas and experiences not dissimilar to those here presented. This is to say that nature and goddess cults make direct spiritual experience readily available, and therefore represent a history of animist or non-dual theological traditions. Then 4, I said, the anima mundi is the totality or singular whole of our planet, within which one can identify discrete portions, both physical and abstract. And then the last one was, expanding on hypothesis 3, ritual practice which cultivates synchronicities, dreams, or mystical experiences are well-known magical techniques that are easily repurposed to enable a communion with the genius loci, which is the spirit of place. Thanks, Diane. This is important since those techniques have often been prejudiced toward either material gain or temple work, in brackets, theurgy, and an ecologically minded individual may have missed its application to their interests. So, the first one I talked about a minute ago. I just felt like maybe these places and these dream figures and things like that are actually outside of us. But their existence defies any explainable way of saying how. It's very difficult to explain how. Maybe one suggestion I've put as point 2, maybe in their visual, aesthetic and sensible, meaning like sensory, the way that you sense them, maybe in their presentation in those 3 ways, the character, which you can always go back to, you know, if you go back there, it comes back to you in the same way very much, right? Like if you go to the Sahara Desert, the way that you sensibly pick up on it is a certain flavour, and you get that flavour when you go back. And maybe that flavour evokes innate but latent images. So maybe that's, in a way, that's like saying maybe the archetypes or spirits or something are actually in our physiology, and it's just a kind of mechanical process of being exposed to it and that process starting. Maybe that exists in all of us, and so maybe maybe humans have that in their common humanality, you know, maybe all life has that. It's actually kind of a quite a pluralistic or quite a like inclusive idea that, and actually it's not just an inclusive idea, but it goes into Schwaller de Lubitz's idea of the doctrine of the anthropocosmos, and that's a big idea really that I lent into, another one that would need a huge chapter on it, that trying to sum that up would be a meaty topic, but really it's saying that as a conscious being, all things are potential in you. Whenever you observe something, whenever you take in information, that information is not completely novel, but resonates with something already in you. So hypothesis 2, really, I should defer, and I should have said that. I should have said hypothesis 2, R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz's doctrine of the anthropocosmos. Number 3, this anima mundi idea. Anima mundi, it's not always called anima mundi, soul of the world, but I just used that word for it. But these ideas of the world as an organism, or there being a world soul, or all those things, maybe they're one part of spirituality. Maybe there is, this transcendent world of spirituality, or this totally introverted world of spirituality in this Gnostic sense of getting to your soul. But maybe there's a third or a second or a fourth or whatever form, which is to touch the person in the world, to touch the soul outside of your soul in things. And that's a form of spirituality in itself. Maybe that's the case. Number 4 was a pretty big idea that I had to write another subchapter about. That the anima mundi is the totality or singular whole of our planet, within which one can identify discrete portions. So my kind of like metaphor for what I meant there, that I use, is think of yourself. You've got me, Kia, but that's made up of lots of smaller things, right? Like my liver is different from my lungs. My lungs are different from my ideas on Italian cuisine. Like, you can see yourself as a totality, but you also can't only see yourself as a totality. You have all these little portions. Things are kind of built from smaller parts. Me, Kia, I'm built from tiny subatomic particles that can like be then categorized as like organs, like my leg muscle, my right leg. That's on one level just exactly the same as everything else, a load of like quarks or whatever. But if you zoom out a bit, it's totally different. My leg, although it's made of quarks, is quite obviously different to my ideas on Italian cuisine. And so all these things come together, and then on the most zoomed out level, you can go, all these things are Kia. And I was thinking that might be what you do with the anima mundi. Maybe there's this collection of persons, and on a certain sort of scale, you see us all as like separate things. This plant is not me, but when you zoom out and out and out, we're all just part of a world organism. That was where I was going with that. And I talked a little bit about hypothesis 5 already, that there are a specific set of techniques that you can call magical, as in they're about altering consciousness or about altering the world by focusing on conscious or spiritual things. There's a certain set of techniques of those which are relevant to the ecologist, but they're currently not being used often. So say, for example, dream work. Dream work primarily is about you as a person, and what are you doing, and what are your problems, and how are they revealed in your dreams. And to other people, dream work's about a kind of synchro mysticism or something like that, to do with what are other people doing, or what's the dynamics of the world like, how are they playing out in my dreams, or whatever. But maybe, and this is a stretch, and it would take a while to get there, but maybe we can communicate with the world in a completely different way. Not ourselves, not the social world, but just like nature and the place you live. Maybe you can also use these dream work things to tap into that. Just as a hypothesis. And Theodore Rorschach, is that his name? Theodore Rorschach writes about that, I think, and I read his book, and I can't remember a lot of it, and it maybe influenced me saying that more than I realised, because when I read his book, which is called... His name is Theodore Rorschach, and his book is called... Basically, he's a psychologist that got into ecology. He's like a kind of radical ecologist. I'd have to look his book up. But I think he goes in a similar direction, that really there should be a psychology of ecology. And I don't think that's talked about a huge amount other than that. Maybe it's talked about more than I realise. I think I thought of it myself based off of where I was going with those experiments. So that's always cool. And yeah, that was the final essay that I wrote. I suppose one thing I should finish up by clearing up is what exactly is talking to plants about. And in my way of seeing it, I think I needed to be a bit smarter, a bit more cunning if I was to if I was to meet the person in things like plants. And so I didn't just start talking to plants like as if I was just imagining they were someone who didn't reply when I said stuff, and just, imagine everything the way I imagine humans. I went on this sort of little bit more crafty route where, well, consciousness has probably got a few different ways of existing, and it's not only in this, very human way of being cerebral, and consciousness being quite like subtle and nuanced about having chats and following rituals and stuff like that. There's also a consciousness in your body. Like if you've got a high fear to spiders, it's a conscious act. Your body is aware of spiders in the way that it pumps you full of adrenaline if you see one. So even we have this kind of more embodied consciousness, and consciousness meaning like awareness or agency. Our body goes, I don't care if that spider's harmless. We're getting super adrenalined up, and you can't really do anything about it, and it just happens on an instinctive level. In that same way, your body responds to things like stress, and it adapts to it. And plants have that exact same thing. They adapt to what you do to them. If I snap a plant but not completely, it's a form of consciousness in the way that it responds, in the same way that it's a form of consciousness for us to have a phobia of spiders, especially in that kind of not just mental narrative about a fear of spiders, but in the way that it literally makes your body change. Your chemistry in your body changes. It changes to, you don't just do weights and get the same result as everyone else. Your body will do its own certain unique thing, its own idiosyncratic thing to the way that you train. Some people will do weights once and then it will make them start growing muscle, and another person will do weights and then just go around talking negatively about the gym for the rest of their life. They're not completely mechanistic. They're not completely in this kind of like materialist way. They're not just dead matter, just doing nothing mechanically. It just has its own, it has a consciousness, it has a unique response. I went on a bit of a tangent then, but what I was going to say was plants, maybe in their uniqueness, speak through gesture. Maybe this plant here, in some way, is doing something quite subjective by being bigger than this one that's the same species here, or just in the number of leaves, or something like that. You can get a feeling for the personality of a plant, the same way as if I'm on a bus and I see someone's funky outfit and I can, although it's not hugely like deep chat where you know everything about them, you do get some sort of sense of character from the way someone appears on the bus in a funky outfit, and you can do that with a plant. You can go, oh, right, yeah, like, nice clothes or whatever. And here's the example in the way that you can see the person in a plant is that in this very the stereotypical plant. You know, if I was to be a bigot about what a plant's like, because I don't know them very well, they all seem very tranquil. Maybe that's a huge stereotype, or maybe it's very true. But one of the things which they give off is just this idea of you can do nothing if you want. That's that's kind of one of the fundamental things of it, or that a human is saying, a plant is saying. And that's a little bit like the way that, you know, men, very masculine, like muscled men, make most other people who aren't them feel sort of like maybe a little bit threatened, but also a little bit sort of like empathy towards their strength. You can be like, I bet that feels empowered, looking like that, looking physiqued up and very fit and stuff. You can generalize to a lot of athletic looking men a stereotype of people around them feel a little bit threatened, but also a little bit sort of like this empathy of like, strength. You can get that from plants. When you go out in nature, maybe it's just like being surrounded by a load of athletic guys, but instead of athletic guys, they're totally silent, totally content people that never need anything other than to just sway in the wind. You can see that as a conscious act, as an act of, although it's like obviously can't do much about it, it's still in some sense a part of their character. So on that note, I'm exhausted. That was a lot of talking, and I'm going to save and upload it and just be like, yeah, that's what I meant by that chapter. And I hope it was illuminating.